Welcome. We are here with Jane Metcalf, entrepreneur, publisher, extraordinaire, amazing human being extraordinaire. Great to be with you. How are you?
Thank you. I'm excellent. I'm delighted to see your digs here.
Yeah, so much to talk about, and we're going to talk all about Neolife, which is extraordinary. But first, I want to talk about you and your background. Such an extraordinary, different set of things that you've done. You were the co-founder of Wired. You've done a chocolate company. You've done all sorts of extraordinary things. Let's go back to the 90s and really that sort of area which we were chatting about earlier. Talk us through a bit about you and what you're most passionate about and how you got started.
Okay. So I was living in Europe, and I answered an ad in the Herald Tribune that led me to an organization that was doing, editorial and financial content, but was using technology in innovative ways to extend the reach and the profile of a very small group of entrepreneurs. And so I met my partner Louis there and ended up moving to Amsterdam to be with him. And at that point, we created a magazine called Electric Word, which was basically about how technology was, basically it was man-machine interface. It was all the technologies that would allow you to communicate. So it was, talking, writing, publishing. So it was everything from voice recognition and speech synthesis to tools for translators and then machine translation. And that got us into studying artificial intelligence and natural language processing and neuro-linguistic programming and all these really crazy.
And no one knew anything about these things at that point in time, right?
Well, the interesting thing was, those fields were all very vertical and you could go really deep into there, but they had no language for communicating across all of those different fields. And so our publication, Electric Word, was a place for, smart people, not just general public, but researchers, to learn about something that they otherwise would never be reading about. And this is a theme that comes back again and again in my life. But we were in Holland, and Philips was super innovative, and they were starting to digitize all these different data types. They had the Walkman, I forget what Philips' version of the Walkman was called. But, music went first. Then they started so of course.
And was this early 90s or?
No, this is 80s.
80s.
This is 80s. And so we saw how all these data types were getting digitized. We came to Macworld in San Francisco, and we met a lot of the engineers working on these things, and they had big dreams about how the technologies they were developing were going to change the world. And they were talking about changing education, they were talking about changing democracy, they were talking about civic participation, they were talking about revolutionizing business, crumbling hierarchies in business so that information could flow, and the hacker in the IT department could suddenly be talking directly to the chairman of the board, which was unheard of in the 80s, and even in the early 90s. This was really not happening. And so we came to San Francisco, and then we plugged into the whole Macintosh community and met that whole scene. The cyberpunks were there too, and all of a sudden it was like, this is really interesting. There's something much, much bigger here than just where's technology taking us. It's like, so anyway, that was sort of. At
that moment in San Francisco, there was the Grateful Dead era and then these cyberpunks. What was the atmosphere back then like in the ecosystem, in the community?
Oh, it was incredibly diverse, so many different points of view, people from all over the world. Some of them were hackers, some of them were, the LGBT community, some of them were, Hispanics involved in, social justice and art, and, everybody was interested. I used to love talking to people about going into different communities and talking about how technology was going to change their community. And I'll never forget this day going into a little theater south of Market and talking to a group of puppeteers.
Wow.
And here are the adventurous few who are experimenting with it. And then the woman goes, yeah, but I make sock puppets. What's technology going to do for me? And so,
was there an aha moment then that led to Wired? Because that seemed like a real turning point, I think, for what was going on at the time. It sort of coalesced a lot of things going on.
Absolutely.
Between art and culture and technology and interesting people.
Exactly. So after Macworld, we came back to Amsterdam, and we were talking to artists who were doing lots of like data visualizations and stuff, and having, pumping visuals into their rave parties, based on algorithms or based on data sets or whatever. And, we just started thinking about all of this and thinking, the world's going to change in profound ways. And we can't just talk about technology. My partner Lewis used to say, if Rolling Stone talked about the rock and roll revolution the way computer magazines are talking about what we call the digital revolution, they would be writing about amps and wah-wah pedals.
But they were talking about the lifestyle of rock and roll and going
and the
on
politics
tour
of rock and roll,
politics
right? And the impact of rock and roll on the world.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
so we wrote the business plan for Wired. We thought about starting it in Amsterdam, but there was no risk capital, so we didn't know who would invest in it. There were very few people who would walk away from their day jobs, and take a winger on getting this thing off the ground. And then from a business standpoint, it was telecommunications costs were killer.
Right.
And I was trying to put together on top of that advertising packages where 11% of my circulation was Holland and 35% was in the UK and 40% was in the US. And it was like, hey guys, let's get on a conference call and talk about budget sharing. It's never going to happen.
Right.
On top of that transatlantic call was costing, exorbitant fees.
$1.50 a minute.
Yeah, exactly. No, way more. It would have been back then in the late 80s, would have been $5, $10 a minute. Yeah. So anyway, we packed up and we came to San Francisco and we found this extraordinary community of people. It's funny, we came to New York first and we went to talk to both computer magazine publishers and consumer magazine publishers, and they just looked at us blankly. The consumer magazine people were like, we don't get it. There's nothing cool about this. And you're trying to tell me Absolut Vodka is going to advertise in this? No way, not going to happen. And the computer magazine publishers were saying, if everything you're saying is right, then everything we're doing is wrong. So therefore you have to be wrong.
Right. So you've just rolled out recently Neo.life, an extraordinary new digital magazine.
Yeah.
Explain what that is and what you're doing here, your vision for Neo.life. And also, I'd love to learn more, what's going on now that may remind you of what was going on both in the 90s and 80s with this cultural sort of revolution that was going on then, for maybe similarities or differences to now? So
many similarities that I'm asking my friends who knew me then to tell me how it's different, because I don't want to get caught in that trap, where you think you can just repeat something that you've done before. And of course, media has been innovated to smithereens, so it's like that clearly is different. But I do see similar things. So there's a lot of people who are deeply, deeply immersed in their fields. Only in this case, they've got an additional 15 years worth of studying, the human body and biology. And they just don't have the bandwidth to think about what's happening in another field. They can't possibly keep up with all of it. And so they're siloed by field. They're also siloed because either they're in academia or they're in industry or they're in clinical practice. And so, the medical world there's so much to learn, there's so much structure around that, there's so much liability around that, and it is life or death in many cases. And so everything's very serious, and there's far fewer people taking wild-eyed, wild-haired risks. And so I just see the opportunity to come in and have experts in the fields, but be able to talk across those fields to an educated audience who have an understanding both of biology and technology, and who can see how these things are converging and conspiring, to help us live longer and defeat diseases and prevent diseases from occurring, and why not make us smarter and happier at the same time? And so we called it a digital revolution back in the 90s, and I think that revolution's kind of played out. We kind of see what that innovation cycle looks like.
Right.
We can see where we need to go with the technology. But what's really interesting is when we turn that technology inward.
Into our bodies.
And we start hacking our own bodies. And CRISPR was just one of those eye-opening moments where it's like, wait a minute, Homo sapiens will never be the same again. Mm-hmm. And what are we designing? And who's talking about this? Where are the platforms for kind of hashing out what we care about and what human beings should look like going forward, And So anyway, I just thought, this is another revolution, and it's neo-biological. And so I basically declared another revolution. And I want to be the Wired.
By the way, I've got my button on here.
Gradient.
So it's, did you originally with Wired, and did you start with a print and then also go digital? And now you're starting digital.
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously, that's by design. Do you ever foresee also doing print?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think print's going to make a comeback, but I think print for short-term purposes doesn't really make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so these ideas, I go back to some of the early essays or not even early, but Wired has a history even today of running, thought pieces that are worthy of being read again and again and again. And yeah, memes come back, on the internet all the time, but I just think by capturing them in print,
Mm-hmm.
be that a beautiful magazine or a book or some other print format, just makes sense. It's sort of like a time capsule. And so, yes, we will definitely do print as we expand. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Whether it's, I'm not going to do a weekly, probably not going to do a monthly, but a quarterly, certainly an annual. Single topic issues, I think, would be really interesting.
Yeah, I hope everyone reads the articles. They're really extraordinary, high
Thank
quality.
We have fantastic writers and a great little team.
And it is the kind of, there's a human interest, lifestyle component, art, culture component. Like, they're very interesting, compelling. It seems like anyone would be interested in reading these articles, even though there's science and biology and technology focus.
So we have writers' guidelines that we give out to our writers, and we ask them, why would this not run in the New York Times or Wired or the New Yorker? What makes it uniquely neo-life? Mm-hmm. And so, it's a question we'll be asking ourselves forever, I think, because it can be for a general audience, but at the moment, general audiences are not thinking about these ideas. And so when I look through, who's signing up, it's a lot of scientists, it's a lot of entrepreneurs, it's a lot of investors, and it's also culture watchers, people who just sense that there's something changing, they can't wrap their arms around it, and they get the sense that they could get a little perspective on it all by reading Neo-Life.
And that's reminiscent to when Wired got going as well,
It's just like Wired.
It seems we're noticing, just in terms of the digital health revolution that's going on, there really is this cross-pollination going on in terms of technology, health, and healthcare, the healthcare industry. We're starting to see a lot of cross-pollination in types of industries coming together: consumer, technology, life sciences, and then other types of health and healthcare. Is this where you see things going, much more of a mashup, if you will, where the lines start to blur, where biology and healthcare becomes much more ingrained into our life?
I think people are, first of all, more than 50% of the diseases in our country are caused by self-inflicted wounds.
Right.
Smoking,
eating.
Exactly. Sedentary lifestyles. And so intelligent people would never expose themselves to those risks, would they? But guess what? They do.
Right.
Why is that? Why am I sitting at my desk for 10 hours a day? Well, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've always been rewarded for pushing myself. And I think our culture, we were talking about this earlier, how many people are entrepreneurs these days, and we know what it takes to be an entrepreneur. It takes going the extra mile. And what suffers? Your health, your relationships, your sleep. You don't eat as well, all these things suffer. So turns out, even being smart and knowing what to do, it's still hard. And so, I think we're all hackers at heart, and we're all trying to figure out, how can I possibly find some balance in my life? How can I mitigate the effects of stress? And so, the place where healthcare meets health is really interesting. It's like, okay, I'm sick, I have a disease, it's inherited, or it's cancer, or it's something, versus I'm a healthy person, and I want to be smarter, and I want to be happier, and I want to be, I want to live longer. And so, I think those two rivers, come together in a place where it's all churning. And, I think your, health transformers have a big opportunity to define their markets, I think, in different ways,
Right.
Because when I tell people I'm doing something in health, they immediately want to introduce me to people running hospitals or
Right.
launching drugs or insurance companies. And I was like, that's not what I'm really talking about.
Right.
I mean, I'm talking about the frontier of diseases, the frontier of longevity, the frontier of fertility. So it's the same. It's not that I'm not interested in insurance companies and pharmaceuticals and hospitals, because I am, because that's where so much of this stuff really, where the rubber meets the road. But I kind of just want to look at it in a slightly different way. And I want to open up the dialogue to think about it in a different way. And I think, I am not a scientist, and I am not even a technologist. I'm an observer, and I watch where things happen and I tend to have a sense of where it's kind of going. And I'll go to these conferences where people are, the MDs, PhDs just blow me away. The dedication, the single-mindedness, the brilliance that they bring to their work is stunning. I could never do that. On the other hand, because I'm out in the world having a much broader range and spectrum of experiences, I think there's something to bring to the table. And they are interested in, an art exhibit or a lab that I went to that they would never have gone to because they're not in neuroscience.
Right.
Or, a meditation practitioner that's learned something extraordinary about themselves.
So are you observing something similar to, with the digital revolution, the eventual leaders, right, sort of disrupted maybe the status quo? We talked about how media has changed as one example. Many industries have been disrupted by the digital revolution. Are you observing, or do you think that in healthcare, we were talking about the traditional healthcare players of the last 50, 100 years, but there's these new wave of innovators, entrepreneurs, thinkers that are looking at biology, healthcare, health tech, but with a totally different lens, more the lens that you're describing. I mean, is it possible or likely, in your view, that the leaders of the future follow kind of a similar path of change and transformation, and we may not even know who's leading healthcare in the future?
No, absolutely. I think it's a wide open field. And what's interesting is it's so personal. It always can boil down to you. And so, we talk about how kind of dreadful it is that the pharmaceutical industry is motivated to not actually cure disease, but to have your patients continue needing those drugs for the rest of their lives.
Right.
What happens when that gets disrupted? What happens when, so we spend $3 trillion on healthcare.
Just in the U.S.?
Just in the U.S. We're pretty clear that our outcomes are diminishing as our investment increases. We're pretty clear that probably a third of that spend is totally wasted, but we don't know necessarily where or how. Compliance with your drug regimens is just one. Over prescribing is another, and so where this all lands is going to be a great, big, giant question. And, in the meantime, what I'm interested in is, I'm not interested in takedowns of things that are broken today. I think every conference I go to, people need to vent, and they need to have those conversations, and I get it. But, what are those bright and shiny new opportunities? It's like the charter school analysis. It's like, yes, public health is broken, and maybe if we just start building an alternative over here from scratch, we'll figure out something better. And so we're looking for examples of people, who have a different way of thinking about it. And we're looking also for people who have a different way of thinking about it and who can help articulate a vision for what the future looks like. Because revolution is, historically about destroying what exists. And it often requires a different group to come in and build whatever comes next. And so I'm actually, even though we call it the neo-biological revolution, I'm actually more interested in what comes next. And so...
well, it seems like the big opportunity is, with technology, people automatically think of Bay Area, Silicon Valley, or some of the other hotspots, Boston, other areas, New York. This seems like a global opportunity. As we think about health, It impacts every human. As we think about the real opportunity to not just focus on the $3 trillion mess over here, but how do we transform health for the 7.5 billion people?
Right.
How are you addressing that with Neolife? Do you see this as a global story, a global mission for how you're thinking?
Absolutely. I mean, I was just in Amsterdam at the Quantified Self Conference, and there were people from Denmark and Sweden talking about the amount of data that is available to public health people to help understand and predict where health problems will occur. Because they don't just have your medical records. They know where you live, they know where you go to school, and it's all, they understand the relationships, that you have, and it's kind of extraordinary. So there's like that thing, Europeans in general tend to have a different view around that because there are municipal services that they get a benefit from when the municipality has all the information. America, we have a very different relationship to that kind of thing. So I think the privacy issues are going to be very important to track across different regions of the globe as we move forward. The AIDS organizations in Africa have just the exact opposite. They've got no information. They don't know where anybody lives. People have no addresses, and but on the other hand, there's 5 billion cell phones out there right now. Right. That's a huge opportunity. There's the Oxford Nanopore sequencer, that can go into the field and help, diagnose disease like on the spot, So places that have no infrastructure can have technologies just like jettisoned in, that are wireless, that can connect up to, additional resources. China, we keep running stories about what's happening in China, right? So a couple of weeks ago, the 20 different CRISPR in-human clinical trials happening in China right now, including one for human papillomavirus in living people. So it would be literally CRISPRing in real time, in vivo. Yeah. So 20 of those experiments are happening in China. Veritas Genetics just announced that they're going to be sequencing 1,500 babies. So the whole opportunity to start sequencing at birth and collect that data and be able to track that over time to understand, people's reactions are, wait, I'm going to be discriminated against. Someone's going to use this information against me. It's like, well, let's at least find out what we can know.
Right.
How can we, and then maybe we can come up with some regulation and shape it in the way that we want to. But the opportunities, are happening in China right now because we have privacy concerns, we have HIPAA concerns, we have regulatory concerns and of course regulations that are actually, policed, as opposed to regulations in other countries that aren't policed.
So you've been a serial entrepreneur. You've done so many wonderful, successful things. Advice to other entrepreneurs just getting started, what should they be thinking about? What should they be doing? What are your biggest lessons learned for getting started? You're starting this new venture. It's very exciting. It's going really well.
Yeah.
Getting going. What do they need to know?
There's a lot they need to know.
What's maybe the most important lesson learned for you over several ventures?
Well, I'll take this down to just an extremely personal level because, as an entrepreneur, I tend to be obsessive and I get rewarded for that behavior. And but it leads me to lower productivity, lower creativity, and lower health. And so one of the things that I'm really consciously doing this time is getting out of my comfort zone, exposing myself to things that I'm not a master of. And I think, I would be asked questions as an entrepreneur, and I always had an answer, always. And if I didn't have an answer, to me, that was failure. And I think allowing yourself to not have the answer and to be thoughtful about that and even transparent about that with your investors is a really great way to bring them into your party and to make them more partners as opposed to potential protagonists who are nevertheless going to write a check for me. And I know that's not necessarily what people want to hear because the minute they open that door to, well, I don't know, now you've got your investor, who's in your pants and like basically telling you what to do. I just think there's a way to navigate that better than I may have done in the past. So I am more experimental today. We had a 5-year plan at Wired, and we followed that plan for pretty much 3.5 years. We didn't anticipate that 3.5 years in, more than half of our company would be doing web-based media, because it didn't exist when we launched. So there's that. But I think, raising capital for 12 to 18 months, and here's what we're going to be experimenting with during that time, and here's what the lessons we want to learn during that time are, is a little bit different than, yes, obviously you have to have metrics and goals and all the rest of it, but I just add that experimentation component in right at the beginning when you bring your investors in. And I think you don't lock yourself into a box, because I see a lot of people seem to be driving down a road and they know they're going to hit the wall, but they can't stop because that's what they promised. And so just opening it up a little bit more.
And it seems that the culture, we were talking about this earlier off camera, in particular Bay Area, it's changed a lot in terms of what's going on entrepreneurially in the Bay Area. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, and how different it is now than maybe a cycle or two ago.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is just, the most powerful force I've ever encountered, to be honest. Wall Street is probably the most powerful force, but Silicon Valley is trumping Wall Street in many ways. And so, and the investment bankers are on that list of professions that are going to be obsoleted. In fact, I met somebody at a large investment bank whose job is basically going to be obsoleting all of his colleagues. And I said, well, what do they think? And he goes, they don't believe it. They don't believe that they're going to be taken over.
This is the old Goldman Sachs building that we're filming in right now.
Oh,
and
you're
it's all
kidding.
Startups now.
Yeah, perfect. To my point exactly. And so, kids, entrepreneurs growing up these days, there is no safety anymore. Going to IBM, of course, was supposed to be the safe thing, and that wasn't. And I think the only safety these days really is in acquiring skills. And so, you have to spend a certain amount of time acquiring as many skills as you can, and then come up with an idea. And my kids in high school did not consider themselves entrepreneurs at the beginning, and now 4, 5, 6 years later, I think everybody thinks that the only safe thing to do is have a lot of skills and be an entrepreneur, which is radical rethink. Because I think people's perception of risk has just gone much higher, and I think their understanding of how the world's going to change and how rapidly it's going to change is coming much faster. And so, it'll be interesting, because not everyone has the mentality to be an entrepreneur, as you know. Which isn't the same thing as going to work for a startup. Right. So there's the leaders who absorb, the body blows, the emotional roller coaster, all the rest of that stuff. And then, of course, still have to display the leadership.
I know you're an optimistic person. Are you optimistic about the future?
Hugely, and particularly if we have a vigorous public debate about the impact of science and technology on Homo sapiens and on our planet. I think we can be, I was at the TED conference this year, and there was a conversation around geoengineering. And one very brilliant scientist said, I just don't think we should be experimenting on our planet like that. And the other brilliant scientist said, well, haven't we been experimenting on our planet for the last 50 years, pumping huge amounts of carbon dioxide and, all the rest of it into the environment? So, I am a firm believer in technology as a way of solving problems that technology has created. And so it just requires very conscientious and very deliberate and very public dialogue. And one of the things that I'm hugely excited about is an example set by somebody like Kevin Esvelt, brilliant geneticist who's done this experiment in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard in explaining the science of gene drives to the local communities there as a way of eliminating Lyme disease, and giving them the keys. Say, look, I'm explaining how this works. I'm going to continue explaining how this works. I'm going to let you drive. If you want me to move forward experimenting with this, I will. And if at any point you want me to stop, I will. And I will always share my results. That's really interesting.
Wow.
Because I think the next 10, for sure, 20 years, Homo sapiens have to make a lot of big choices.
Yes.
And if we leave it to the scientists, we're missing out on the diverse voices that should all be involved, that should all be sitting at the table. And so I'm very optimistic that we will devise the structures to make that happen. And I hope that Neolife can play some role in that debate.
So everyone should go to neo.life and subscribe. It's absolutely extraordinary. Jane,
And the .life domain name is uninhabited right now,
Ooh,
which
okay.
startup health people should take advantage of.
Go check out the .life. Jane, just want to thank you for being so influential, inspirational. You've really, the work that you've been involved with and helped lead has really, I think, impacted at least a generation or two of the future's entrepreneurs and creators. And so just want to thank you for everything that you've already done, and so excited about what you're doing with Neolife.
Well, thank you, Unity. I'm thrilled to be here. I think Startup Health has chosen the most important work to be doing today, which is let's solve the health piece first, then productivity, then clean environments, then everything else can come into play. But if you don't have your health, what do you have?
Right.
So
Thank you.